so good at guitar, it's a wonder I'm not swooning in pussy right now. Just saying.
Jeez, dude. I tell him not to quit his day job, but I don't think that guy got a day job. Radio Free and Smith, episode 332, talking about some thrash today.
어플로 주문을 하던가?
That's right, I said thrash. Because depending on what region that you're from, a lot of the stuff that we call thrash metal today would have been called speed metal back in the 80s. And a lot of the stuff that we call crossover thrash or whatever today was just called thrash back then. I talked about it more about a year ago, episode 277 on the Dirty Rotten Imbeciles, if you'd care to know more. But when I say thrash in the context of this episode, we're talking about what is nowadays known as crossover thrash. You know, surprisingly for a man who appears to have some sort of genetic allergy to fun, Brett Stevens, of all people, is a big proponent of this style of thrash, and he also did a really good job defining it, wherein he says that thrash was a genre that came into existence after the initial wave of hardcore punk died, but before death metal took off. A hybrid of speed metal and extreme hardcore, distinguishing itself with 30-second long songs, metallic riffs, an utter loathing for and confusion with society, and having lyrical content behind all the jokes and 80s hardcore silliness that was essentially Nietzsche's concept of the philosophical hammer, wherein you test every concept you find, in this case in the news or high school or whatever, and you spit out a binary verdict, sane or insane. You know, this is cool, this sucks. I'm not going to say I agree on the guy with everything, but as far as that definition of thrash goes, I think he's pretty much got it nailed. Depending on how into the style you are, the first band that might come to mind for you playing this kind of music might be DRI or SOD or Suicidal Tendencies if you're a fucking If you're a little bit more into the genre proper, you know some of the key bands like Wehrmacht, Cryptic Slaughter, Attitude Adjustment, and if you're a real wacko, you might even know some of the really underground stuff like Cerebral Fix, Chronicle Diarrhea, or the Crumbsuckers. The band we will be talking about today fits kinda between those last two categories. If you were around back then in the 80s, I'm willing to bet that if you were into this kind of music, you probably knew them. Nowadays, I don't see them mentioned all that much. The Fearless Iranians from Hell, a band from San Antonio, Texas, which may or may not actually feature anybody of Iranian descent. In fact, I'm pretty sure it doesn't. The Fearless Iranians are less actual like Persian people and more sort of a comic booky character the band kind of came up with as a concept. They're not from Iran, they're from Iran, and they're really grumpy. They're big into surfing and killing people and smoking hash, and they're gonna get you. And they're also the intentionally offensive vector through which this particular thrash band decides to apply that philosophy of the hammer we discussed earlier. As far as the From Hell and Fearless parts go, San Antonio's pretty warm this time of year, and these guys certainly weren't afraid of being quite offensive with their lyrical content.
I'm gonna kill a Marine! I wanna ruin his family!
They also have a song called Dog Sperm. Their big early hit on their very first 7-inch single was the charmingly entitled Blow Up the Embassy, some of which you already heard in that little sample. We're going to dive a little bit deeper into the song's structure as a whole, primarily based around that really catchy riff that gives way to ranting.
I'm gonna kill myself! I wanna lie dead on the floor! It's none of your fucking business! What I live and die for!
Before then jumping back into the riffing and overlaying the shouting on top of it, eventually tying it all together with sort of a chromatic, almost surf rock-ish bridge, and eventually exploding into an incredibly catchy chorus.
Blow up the embassy! Blow up the embassy!
It's pretty simplistic, hardcore punk kind of stuff, but it's damn good at what it does. And what it does is tickle my eardrums and probably offend a whole lot of people back in the 80s.
I know what you're thinking.
That just sounded like some kind of catchy hardcore punk to me. That wasn't no fucking crossover thrash. Well, you're kind of right. I would argue there was at least some metallic component to their sound, even in their early days. But by the time they get their first full-length album out, 1987's Die for Allah, they are definitely playing some crossover thrash. But it may surprise you exactly what kind of metal they are crossing over with on this album. The instrumentation on this one is a lot more technically complex and adventurous, and much of the same can be said for their songwriting, which is taking taking a turn towards the epic, or at least as epic you can be inside a 30-second song. But as you're hearing right now, the metal that they are crossing their punk with isn't always necessarily just speed metal. This part right here actually reminds me a whole lot of some very groove-oriented new wave of British heavy metal like Holocaust or something. Real catchy stuff, going into a very tense sort of build-up section, wherein the band are laying out their lyrical mission statement quite nicely. And then some really crazy stuff happens. Somehow our fearless Iranians managed to smoke enough hash that they actually turned into really good guitar soloists. Like, these guys solo shred almost unlike anything else in this genre besides Wehrmacht. This part coming up right here is also another really weird example of them mashing genres together. Getting this like surf rock mixed with rockabilly mixed with thrash rendition of almost a 12-bar blues structure. It would be goofy if they didn't seem so serious about their very violent concept. As the album continues onward, it goes into even more expansive new directions. This set of riffs right here is equal parts 1982 UK punk and epic melodic heavy metal. Lyrically, it tackles standard sort of crossover thrash topics like, wow, shit sure fucked up in the news, but in this case they're reveling in it because they are the fearless Iranians from hell that are causing all the problems. This little section right here goes straight fucking angular post-punk, combining sort of an art rock thing with very gallop-heavy Priest-style shit. Yeah, it's crossover, but they're crossover in way different kinds of music than you usually see going on in crossover, which is already a very bohemian sort of genre. And they don't just limit it to different kinds of punk and different kinds of metal. They even go into like some weird, almost Hawkwind-style space rock at points. I mean, check out that flanger, dude. Shit's pretty fucking crazy. It's worth mentioning that one guy in this band was actually in an early version of the band Butthole Surfers, and you can definitely hear that during their more adventurous sections of their music. There's quite a bit of alt-rock before alt-rock was commodified style stuff going on. You can hear with those natural harmonics going up and down the neck. And then it all collapses in a wash of noise from which a blazing hardcore crossover thrash phoenix emerges with some very GBH style riffing. And some more lyrics about how they're gonna beat you up and kill you and smoke all your weed. Standard fearless Iranians from hell type stuff. Then going into some more almost kind of like boogie rockish sounding shit. Really fucking cool album. And if they had only done that and the single would blow up the embassy on it, they'd still be an all-time classic band. But scarcely 2 years later, they decided to drop another album on your fat, foolish American ass. 1989's Holy War, which might be their finest effort. I really loved the production on this album, that bassy, soupy guitar tone, those really snappy snare drums, thick percussive weight to everything, and of course the vocals are impeccable. Definitely the culmination of the kind of thing they were going for back on Blow Up the Embassy. And of course they got a really good tension-building riff set before going into what's probably the coolest solo section they ever did. Like, you're not gonna believe this shit when you hear it. Like, dude, they built tapping into the riff. This ain't gent, this is tech hardcore thrash, bro. And then the actual solos kick in and it's like, holy fuck, dude, this band shreds. Like, why is this goofy fucking band going so hard? But that's what the best of this kind of thrash was all about. That's why it's one of my favorite genres, and I feel like it's criminally overlooked in the standard metal stylistic canon nowadays. There's definitely more to this stuff than pizza and drinking beer. This album can get real gloomy and melancholic in a way that you might not expect from what is kind of a joke band. Behind all of the faux Iranian jihadi posturing, these guys really were deeply troubled by the direction they saw society going in, and that atmosphere comes forth most effectively during the doomier bits. This one's cool because when it speeds up after the fade out, it still maintains the melodic character of that prior doomy bit. This song, Force Down Your Throat, is kind of the emotional centerpiece of the album and sort of its epic track. It's kind of like their Orion or Fade to Black, except instead of being a really long song, it's a song that's 3 minutes long instead of 1:30. But it manages to cram a whole lot of musical content and different movements into that short section of time. This part coming up right here is so sick. It's like their version of a Slayer break. It's got the jugga 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 and the ascending chromatic riffs. But at the same time, it also sort of preserves this like outlaw rock and roll feel, which definitely carries over into the very frenetic soloing. They don't just do surprisingly slow thrash songs on this album either. They can straight up bust out the doom metal when they need to. Like, holy fuck, bro, what the fuck's this Manila Road shit going on here? Fill in the space between proclamations and more doom riffs. The sense of groove coming from these guys is fucking wild. And then boom, fast thrashcore on the scene, fitting in incredibly well between those doom metal riffs. Speaking of which, we gotta bring that shit back. Now with some lead guitar that actually reminds me a lot of Autopsy. I bet you Chris and the gang were probably big on these guys back in the 80s. I know King Fowley from Deceased sure was. For me, Holy War is probably the best Fearless Iranians album, but its 1990 follow-up, Foolish Americans, is also right up there. This one's got a much more standard punk style production with a very bright guitar sound compared to that menacing murk that was on their second album. But in terms of songwriting, it's definitely a continuation of what that album was about. Featuring, as always, their characteristic heavy dose of fucking groove, with the mullah ranting over all of it. Getting downright apocalyptic and scary on this album. Another great doom and gloom riff, bringing us into some wacky fucking soloing, because of course they gotta have wacky fucking soloing. It's Fearless, dude. Best fucking crossover solos in the business. Like Holy War and Die for Allah, there's a heavy emphasis on variety of styles being worked into their thrash metal cauldron. There's a bit of funkiness to some of these songs that wasn't really part of their sound back in the 80s so much. I guess it's not that unusual for thrash at the time. I just feel like these guys do it way better than, you know, Suicidal Tendencies or whoever else. Vocal delivery on this album can get intensely rhythmic to the point where it's almost kind of hip-hop-ish while still maintaining its thrashcore core. You know, a lot of back and forth with the really percussive riffs. Going into another fucking sick solo section here, because you know there's going to be one. These guys are consummate lead guitar players. Even after the solo ends, you get these cool little clean guitar, like jangly intrusions. Almost reminds me of some of the more funk-influenced Gargoyle tracks, oddly enough. And in my estimation, that's always a good thing, because funk gargoyle might actually be my favorite form of gargoyle, depending on when you ask me. This little tribal section here is pretty cool. And it's building up towards something that, come on, you gotta expect from your funk-inflected crossover thrash track, right after we get to more of that boogie-woogie shit. It's everyone's favorite, the gang shout into the fade out. Okay, that's how you end a song like that. They done did a good job. Another thing they brought back from the Holy War album is that weirdo brand of doom metal that they'd been experimenting with. This time around, it combines with the more rhythmic approach to the vocal cadences, giving the lyrics a lot more room to breathe, and it really does make the parts where he's supposed to be preaching to the congregation sound way more like actual preaching. Very atmospherically appropriate. Probably scared some kids' parents back in the 80s. Here's some more cool stuff where they're sort of combining an epic heavy metal feel with downright jangly kind of art rocky post-punk stuff. Maybe a bit of the Meat Puppets in there, or Minutemen, No Means No, you know, those kind of bands. And that feeling continues into this cool little section right here. Nice little extended instrumental break. Heavy emphasis on bass guitar and those cool kind of country fried bend heavy riffs. So there you go, that's Fearless. The Iranians from Hell, a band that I can almost guarantee you weren't listening to prior to listening to this show, if I know my audience at all, but I feel like they're well worth checking out if you want to hear some really cool shit from the 80s that you may have missed out on. There's a CD out there that combines Foolish Americans, Holy War, and Die for Allah all on one disc, which I would say is absolutely essential. Hopefully you agree with me, but even if you didn't, thanks for listening or watching or whatever you did, and I'll see you next time.
So I'm telling you right now, YouTube, if you don't get some of this tactical soap, you're being an absolute tool, my dude.